This episode is a deep, deep dive into the Dies Irae musical motif and its evolution through film music. Here to talk about it is Dies Irae guru Alex Ludwig, who has just written a book about it. Hello there, and welcome to Star Wars Music Minute, where we celebrate the music and sound of Star Wars. I'm Chrysanthi Tan, feel free to call me Xanthi, and I'm a composer, violinist, and music critic who's been lucky enough to meet some incredibly cool people through this podcast, people whose areas of scholarship often coincide perfectly with what I and what my listeners are interested in. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Alex Ludwig, a music historian and media scholar at Berklee College of Music, who's been tracing the evolution of the Dies Irae in film music since 2018. I've had him on the show 3 times already to discuss the Dies Irae in A New Hope and in Solo: A Star Wars Story, and also just to chat about The Empire Strikes Back. But today's episode will be focused solely on the Dies Irae itself. Alex has a new book coming out soon called Hearing Death at the Movies, Film Music and the Long History of the Dies Irae. And having read some early drafts myself, and more recently a finished preview, I not only recommend it, but I will certainly be using the book as a reference on this podcast in the future. Without further ado, welcome back to the show, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on.
I learned a lot from reading your book, and I'm very excited about it because a lot of the questions that I've long had about the Dies Irae have been answered in the book. And I've really been wanting more rigor in my conversations about the Dies Irae and more of a historical background and just basis for the things that I'm saying. And so, yeah, your book is going to make me say smarter things on the podcast.
I love to hear that. That's what every author dreams, that someone out there is reading the book and putting it to good use.
For sure. So how did your Dies Irae scholarship begin?
Yeah, so this has been a long project. This began 10 years ago when I first started working at Berklee. I've been teaching courses in film music and courses in just the Western classical canon, and the Dies Irae comes up a lot, again and again. And I kept bringing in film clips to sort of illustrate my points that this piece of medieval music was reappearing in the 19th century and then again in modern era in films. And this really sort of helped make those connections for my students. And so as those classes sort of continued, my students would find other examples of the Dies Irae. And at that point, I had to start creating a list. It was just becoming too obvious not to start tracking this. And so my list began on a little Apple Notes, list on my phone as students would come up to me before class, after class, and I would give them extra credit if they would find examples not on my then short list. And now my list is around 300 examples today. So it's been a process.
I wish I was your student. I would have been all over that.
Well, and now if I talk to a non-student, I have to buy them a coffee or something else. So we'll see. We'll see. I still get emails to this day. Actually, I have an email in my inbox right now that I have to double check to see if it's an actual Dies Irae quotation or not. Yeah.
I mean, I confess that yesterday I was watching something, and then 2 days ago I was watching something, and both times I was like, need to check if it's on the list. And then I actually have an Apple Note myself that is Dies Irae's to tell Alex.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Send them over. Send them my
behind,
way.
but there's so many.
Yeah. I mean, it's a never ending project, which is kind of scary. I've been dealing with death in music for the last couple of years, really intensely. And I keep joking with my friends and family that the next project has to be happier than this one. I've got to pick something that's lighter than the Dies Irae. That's for sure.
This is kind of you may not remember, but do you remember the first time you learned about the Dies Irae?
It must have been in my undergrad class. So forever ago. And was it in my music history?
Was it in the context of classical music or like film music?
It was definitely classical. It would have been the Berlioz Symphonie fantastique. I'm sure that was probably the first time I really sort of dug into it. Yeah.
Yep. And that's the first time I learned about the Dies Irae was when I was in orchestra playing Symphonie fantastique.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a big sort of entrance point for a lot of people.
Yeah. That's actually probably a good place to start as we talk about the Dies Irae.
Yeah. Well, and that's why it's really in the first major chapter of the book. The book starts with Wendy Carlos and Berlioz because these are probably the two biggest on ramps for people's interest in the Dies Irae, whether it's The Shining or the Symphonie Fantastique. And so the Symphonie Fantastique is really it is a pivotal moment for the Dies Irae because it takes it from this very sacred place in which it had been for 500 years in Europe. It was part of the Requiem Mass. It was heard and performed at funerals. So it had this cultural memory built up with it. And so what changes in the 19th century here with Berlioz is that he now takes this sacred melody and transforms it into a secular one. Whereas before it was a very religious and liturgical thing. Now it is symbols of skeletons and ghosts and the supernatural. And so it is really this one moment of transformation from the sacred to secular. And this sort of opens up a new realm of possibility for the Dies Irae as we get into then the 19th century and classical music proper.
Yeah, and Symphonie Fantastique was about 1830.
Right.
So this would have been kind of in the beginnings of the capital R Romantic period in classical music.
Right.
And it was a programmatic symphony. So there's a whole story that goes with it. Maybe we should listen to an example.
Sure. Can I just give a little primer on the story if you're not familiar with it? It's sort of Inception-like. There are layers within layers and dreams within dreams. And it's a 5-movement symphony, which is pretty unusual. It's sort of like a mega symphony. And each movement tells a unified story. So it's like chapters in a book. And as you move throughout this symphony, there's a sort of the artist and his beloved. And by the end of the symphony, the beloved has turned from something who was idolized and who he loved into something much different than that. The final symphony is called Dream of a Witch's Sabbath. And so the beloved is reinterpreted as this witch, as this sort of supernatural being. And so Berlioz, one of the things we know about Berlioz was that he was really fascinated in orchestration, that he loved to use instruments in unusual ways. So as a violinist, colegno, turning the stick over and sort of hitting the strings in a percussive, rhythmic way. Mm-hmm. Like that. Right, which makes the violin sound not like a violin. And so Berlioz incorporates that sound to give us those creepy crawlies, the sort of skeletons dancing. There are church bells ringing. There are sort of blaring, bizarre woodwind instruments. And so he's setting this scene, and this story appears in the program. It's midnight. It's a church graveyard, and there are witches and ghouls and goblins swirling around a cauldron. And so that's where we are here in the 5th movement now.
Yeah, this is commonly programmed around Halloween concerts.
It's fantastic Halloween music. Yeah.
Totally. All right, here we go. This is from the 3rd movement, the 5th movement.
Yeah.
I realized that we never exactly defined the Dies Irae, what the melody is, but it's basically in that with an asterisk.
Yes, and that's another thing that makes the Berlioz a sort of interesting moment. We hear it played in this very low bass register. We've got tubas and bassoons with really dark timbres, and it is a couple. It's depending on how you define it, a couple different phrases together. this musical poem. And so we hear the first two, and then a third, sort of the third phrase in variation, I guess you could say. Do you want to play just the first phrase, or?
Yeah. Sorry.
Right. So that's important for our story, because we're going to take that melody and it's going to go through a series of different transformations throughout the book, not necessarily here in the Berlioz, but it's important to have that phrase, that first primary phrase, sort of ingrained in our story.
Yes. The first 8 notes. There are also lyrics that go with this when it's sung, obviously. I don't know them by heart, but it's like Dies Irae, you know them.
Dies Irae, Dies Illa, Day of Wrath, Day of Reckoning, sort of. It's a real, the poem it starts very fire and brimstone. It is the day of judgment in which Jesus is going to come back and judge everyone for their sins. And so everyone is called to judgment. All these skeletons are drawn forth from their graves. And so you've got skeletons, you've got fire and brimstone. It's a real, last judgment kind of scene the poem is setting.
So when classical composers like Mozart were doing requiems and doing Dies Irae, would this have been in there in all of the requiems that have a Dies Irae movement?
Yes. And so what's interesting about the Mozart Requiem, which is a really famous example of the Requiem, the actual Dies Irae melody, a little bit different. He uses a different melody than the normal melody we're used to. Verdi as well, later in the 19th century, another very famous Requiem, but not the Dies Irae melody. Still the text is still there, but they both use different melodies. Those are sort of outliers. Most of these standard requiems have this melody in it, though.
Cool. The text of the Dies Irae will hopefully come up later.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so the Wendy Carlos connection, which I didn't know about. I mean, I knew that Wendy Carlos and used the Dies Irae heavily in The Shining, but I didn't realize such the direct connection from Berlioz to Carlos.
Yeah, and I that was sort of new to me too. I knew obviously that the Berlioz would be an inspiration, but not to such the degree that it was. Wendy Carlos, actually, let's take it back a step. We're talking about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining here now in 1980, and Kubrick literally asks Carlos for music about graves and ghosts. So she sort of immediately latches on to the Berlioz and gives Kubrick an LP of the Berlioz, of the Symphonie Fantastique. And so we have this direct connection here. Now, if you know anything about Kubrick, once he hears a piece of music and really it works for him, he wants that music. So famously in 2001, A Space Odyssey, he fell in love with the temporary track, which was the pre-existent music, and ignored the Alex North soundtrack. And so that's sort of what happens here too. Wendy Carlos drafted 20, 30 different tracks, a lot of them Dies Irae inspired, and he discarded them all. He really only wanted this original composition, and he kept cutting it back to make it sound more and more like the Berlioz. So they are really intertwined, the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique and Carlos's Shining score.
So to be clear, because I've heard the Shining score and the lost scores. What was it? Rediscovered?
Yeah. Rediscovered
Carlos.
Scores. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was a Wendy Carlos album that had music that was not used
Right.
in The Shining. There's Dies Irae heavily laced throughout many, many, many of the tracks.
Right.
But the one that Kubrick wanted to keep was a version that stayed very true to the Berlioz version of the Dies Irae.
Correct. And he kept peeling away new additional layers that Carlos was adding. He said, I want it to sound like the Berlioz. It has to sound exactly like the Berlioz. And so he kept sort of rejecting these new and different versions until she really sort of stripped it down to an almost sound-alike to the Berlioz.
Yeah. Okay. I'd love to play an example. Let's see.
Okay.
Which one would you like to start with?
So do you want one that sounds like the main titles or one that just has the Berlioz, the Dies Irae referenced?
Either one. We'll do both.
I think Colorado is an interesting one. As a cellist, there's some good cello stuff in it. So
Yeah,
as a cellist, I like that one. If you want to play that.
Yeah, let's do that. And to be clear, did this one make it into the film?
No.
Okay.
No.
Yep. There we go. Wow.
So this is the big and brassy sort of opening. You could imagine this as being a sort of fanfare, right? A sort of opening title sequence. In fact, Carlos describes it as big and brassy, which is pretty accurate.
Yeah.
So I had a different one in my head that was more cello forward.
Yeah, I think you're thinking of Paraphrase for Cello.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So we'll get to that in a second. Okay. So do you hear the Dies Irae in the Colorado clip that we just played?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's so like the clusters of notes and just the kind of cacophony that's in it is very different from how I'm used to hearing it in films.
Right. It's got a lot of the same. It's almost like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. It's saying the same thing, but in a different language. Maybe there's a different accent, right? But it is following the same sort of melodic shape of that Dies Irae. And so you could see the thought process of how Carlos would have gotten from the Dies Irae to this Colorado clip. But then you could also see why Kubrick would say, no, thank you. This does not sound exactly like the Dies Irae, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you have the Berlioz in your head for the temp track, you're not going to be satisfied by that.
Can we play one more?
I
want to play the Paraphrase for Cello, but can we play the Fanfare and Drunken Dies Irae? Because there's a fascinating story about that one that I'd like to tell.
Yeah. Okay.
So no Dies Irae yet, but
right.
Here. So
it's quite a unique timbre.
Yeah. So that's what's really fascinating. It's in the treble clef, which
it's way up
is
there.
much higher than we're used to hearing, and very high in that regard. It's also in a triple meter, right? So this Dies Irae, when in the medieval period, rhythm, it was much different than we're used to today, right? And so the chant is usually considered arrhythmic in a way. It is sort of following the syllables of the poem. Right there, that's a great way to see it. And so it's very rarely set in triple meter like this. But it's called Fanfare and Drunken Dies. If you're familiar with the story, you know Jack is stuck alone. Well, he's stuck at this hotel with his wife and child, and he's an alcoholic. And so this was supposed to accompany one of those scenes where he is drinking. He's not supposed to be drinking, right? And so you can almost picture him stumbling through the halls of the Shining Hotel while this is playing. Again, did not make the final film.
That's a shame. It's also like it sounds so delicate to me and like waltz like.
Right. You picture that big ballroom at The Shining. And so I wonder if she was trying to sort of work in a reference to that. So along those lines, there's a cue called Where's Jack? Did I give you that one?
Yes, you did.
Oh, let's play this for a second.
Okay.
So this is a longer cue. We don't have to play the whole thing. But this was originally supposed to accompany Wendy, Jack's wife, when she discovers the all work and no play sequence. When she walks into that room where Jack is typing on the typewriter. And so what happens is we get little Dies Irae fragments, like here. So it sort of like slithers in and out of the soundscape.
Yeah.
And when you sync this to the actual film, it works really well because she's like moving in and out of the frame and there are like columns in the way, and then Jack eventually appears. And so there's this Dies Irae coming in and out, and then there's a very Jaws-like reference of that sort of ominous half-step growling down in the bass. Dun, dun, dun. And Kubrick sort of references Jaws, too, as a Jack-like stand-in. And so I love, when I found that and synced it up to the film, it was like a light bulb went off. It's like, oh, I really see what Carlos wanted here. We really see how she could have used the Dies Irae as a sort of bigger sort of reference to what was about to happen and obviously what does happen in the film.
Yeah. I'm also noticing how the Dies Irae is appearing on a bed of, I guess, other, I don't know what to call them, tropes, other hallmarks of maybe horror, like the tremolos, which you do cite in a later chapter, as being kind of a hallmark of the supernatural. I think that was a quote from Kendra Preston Leonard's work.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. I think it's one thing going through like a lot of the examples in your book that struck me was how the Dies Irae appears in so many different ways. Like there are many ways to do it. We hear quite a variety. Yeah, that's a really cool one.
Yeah, I really like that one, and you're right that the Dies Irae is a musical referent. It's a reference to horror. It has really become embedded as this sort of ominous sort of marker, and we could talk about some of those other examples too as we go. Just as a note, I counted there are 87 transcriptions in the book, almost all of which I did on my own, sort of based on the film's soundtrack itself. So it can get a little in the music analytical weeds, but I think if you're not conversant in music analysis, I think the book is still approachable. I think, if you're interested in film and film history, there's still a lot in the book for you.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Would you agree? Okay. That's what I was kind of
I would
hoping.
definitely say so.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think it'll be clear from the first, from the, what chapter, is chapter one, the Wendy
Chapter
Carlos?
one
No,
is the
that's the second one.
introduction. So Wendy
Yeah.
Carlos is chapter 2.
Yeah. I think that one will, that chapter alone is like an excellent primer on the Dies Irae. It was like the lineage of, because you draw a pretty clear picture between like, you going from the chant from the original Dies Irae,
Right.
part of Mass, and then it being sort of debased a little bit, or appearing
Right.
in a different way,
Right.
being divested from its original
Right.
religious purpose,
Liturgical, sacred purpose. Right.
and then appearing in Symphonie fantastique, and also sparking other classical, pieces that were kind of inspired by that, probably like
Right.
Rachmaninoff and Cezanne, Dance Macabre.
Right.
So then there's the
Zorsky
classical.
as well. Yep.
Yeah, totally. And then going from Symphonie fantastique to Wendy Carlos, and then The Shining, and then so many things being inspired by The Shining. So it's like just a
So yeah, so at the end of that second chapter, that Carlos Berlioz chapter, is a sort of, it's almost like a coda, looking at a few TV shows that are specifically referencing the Carlos and The Shining, especially. And so it's fascinating to me. We've got this 500 years of sacred music, right? And then Berlioz turns it into secular music, and then it transforms into film music in the early 20th century. And so you could sort of stamp those moments, the Berlioz, The Shining, as key signal moments that people then can go backwards to. They have long shadows in and of themselves. And so I really wanted that to be up front in the book. I didn't know how else to start this book, but with The Shining, you couldn't not really focus there, because it really is impactful going forward and sort of looking backward at the Berlioz at the same time.
there's a little bit of synergy with Frank Lehman's book, Hollywood Harmony, here, where I think it's just the time, the point in music that this is all happening, and film scoring sort of really beginning in the early half of the 20th century. Film scoring really was an outcropping of the Romantic movement, and it makes sense. In fact, Frank calls American film scoring as the arm of the long 19th century, and American film scoring inherited many tropes that typify Romanticism. He has a whole chapter called The Romantic Inheritance in Hollywood Harmony. So it kind of makes sense that if film composers were going to be borrowing from Romantic tradition, it makes sense that the evolving use of the Dies Irae would also infiltrate film music.
Right. And that first generation of the early masters, we're talking about people like Max Steiner, Franz Waxman, Alfred Newman, to a lesser extent, but still that time period, almost all of them studied with, and at least studied the music of, Mahler, Bruckner, and so on. And so it makes sense for those composers to now take that music and bring it into film music, because that's what they were used to. That's what they were trained with. That's what they were exposed to. And so you're right, the 1920s and 30s and 40s, that's sort of the golden age. They incorporate a lot of these tropes, and the Dies Irae is probably the master trope in many ways. So,
yeah. I don't know if you want to name drop any of the things that The Shining influenced, but when you're talking about the tropes, that I'm thinking of your silent film section. I'm thinking of like how the Dies Irae was also used in silent films and in so many vampire movies.
well, yeah, and so that's the next chapter. Is really, I wanted to give a sort of historical overview of where the Dies Irae has really sort of flowered, especially in film music. And so the next chapter, chapter 3, just as an aside, I have to tell you, for the whole year that I was really intensely writing this book, the Carlos chapter was the first chapter. And in my head, they were chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, the main chapters. But my publisher didn't want the introduction not to have a number. So the
Oh.
introduction at the very end of the process became chapter 1. And so in my brain, it's like indelibly marked as chapter 1, but it's really chapter 2. So anyway, chapter 3, which was always chapter 2 in my head, is the historical overview. And so I look at silent film until 1927. I look at a cluster of films by a composer named Dimitri Tiomkin, who was really prominent in the 40s and 50s. And then I looked at vampire films, mostly around the 70s. Each of these clusters had a sort of a flowering of Dies Iraes in them, and it was fun to pull back these layers to see how these were all sort of related. The early silent film really came to a head with the great masterpiece Metropolis. Which was a film that I was familiar with, but had not really dug into. And it's a very rewarding film. There's a lot here. Have you ever seen it before?
I haven't, but given how many of your clips were from Metropolis, I was like, wow.
Yeah, I mean, you will, but once you get into there's a lot of Star Wars here. There's a C-3PO robot that looks very much like George Lucas said, I want that robot as C-3PO. So yeah, I don't want to spoil it, but yeah, it would be very rewarding to a watch. So,
shall we play a clip from Metropolis that kind of,
sure.
Okay, we have several.
Okay,
we can, and they all kind of show something different.
Yeah. Do you want to play the Statue of Death marching? Do you have the video of that? Did I give you the video for that?
I believe you did. Do you know which figure number it is?
3. Let's see. 3.1, is that correct? No.
It might be 3.3.
Okay, let me just. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's just the titles are cut off, so it's like all I see is Metropolis.
Let me see.
Statue. Okay, I have Metropolis Type 2B, Metropolis Infurioso, Metropolis Beginning Intermezzo.
Let's do Furioso.
Okay, we'll do.
Oh, sorry. No, let's do Beginning of Intermezzo. I think that might be better. We'll find out.
Yeah. Beginning of Intermezzo.
So that's not the one with death, but that's a good one too. So Freder, the main character, he's gone down and fallen in love with this Maria, who he can't find. She's been kidnapped at the end of the first act, and this is the beginning of the second act. And this second act is Dies Irae everywhere. There's tons and tons of Dies Irae quotes because they're alluding to this biblical apocalypse that's going to take place. That's going to sort of destroy the city of Metropolis. So at one point, he goes into a statuary and sees death standing amidst statues of the 7 sins. And that's what I was hoping. I don't think I gave it to you, unfortunately. Okay. But so a statue of death comes out and is playing a bone flute, and the melody is the Dies Irae. So it's pretty on the nose, I think you could say.
What is it? Is it Don Giovanni or Don Juan that does that? It has like a weird voice. An opera. Anyway, but
Don Giovanni, the statue comes and drags him down to hell. Yeah. So it's very much on the nose. So that's what we're going for. But yeah, Metropolis is a fantastic, very epic, very big, it's a huge cast and really tremendous sets and a great score. And it's an original score, which was pretty unusual for silent films of this time, right? These sort of epic silent films a lot of them had pre-existent music, but this was an original score. So
Was it one of the
again,
first
sort of
original
pushing the
scores?
envelope. One of the first, yeah. There are a handful of others that are big films like this, but this is really sort of the pinnacle of silent film era, and it's the same year where Talking Pictures, where the jazz singer starts. So it's sort of the end of the silent film era, and we move into Talking Pictures at the same time.
I'm wondering if you can go back to earlier silent films. How was the music for silent films done?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And it's kind of, again, as historians, we like to talk in neat, discrete figures, and there's a lot of overlap, right? So there are a couple different stages of silent film. The earliest and the easiest was just improvised pianists, a single pianist sitting in an auditorium and playing against what he or she was seeing on the screen. Usually women tended to be these silent film accompanists. And then as this, depending on where you were, if you were in a bigger city, you have a bigger sort of orchestra at your fingertips. And for those people, they tended to have what were called cue books, sort of like fake books, a Broadway fake book, where you could turn to a page and you can get Phantom of the Opera or whatever sort of melody you wanted.
Yeah, just like
so
melody
they would
and chords.
distribute these. Exactly, right. And so they would have those. Sometimes they would have musical excerpts as well. And so
Like from classical music?
found from classical music, and it was more modern. So it would have been composers like Wagner or Verdi or composers that people would have recognized. But there were also melodies like the Dies Irae. And so a lot of these cue books would say, oh, if you want something romantic, turn to page 19 and it'll be a romantic melody. If you want something scary or spooky, turn to page whatever the page number is. And frequently some of those examples were the Dies Irae. And that's you see that. So the narrative of the Dies Irae as music for spooky scenes is sort of instilled in us right there. And so I included a couple examples of those in the book in this early part of the chapter.
I would love to get my hands on on one of those old cue books.
Oh,
have you seen one?
They're great. Yeah, not in person. There are a lot of PDFs available online of them. Yeah,
Ooh,
cue
I need
books.
to find. Okay.
Yeah, I'll send you some. I'll send you some after this. Yeah,
That'd be cool.
because it really is fascinating to sort of see how they would have organized these. And then there are others where they were specifically for the film, and so it would say in the first reel, play this cue. In the second reel, halfway through, play this cue. And so you could see it got more and more complicated as they go. Mm-hmm. And then those later silent films had original scores, like Metropolis.
And what are pastiche scores?
So it's sort of that middle point between these cue books and original scores. And so sometimes they would include this classical music, and others they would include original music. It's sort of like a grab bag. Again, things were not nearly as concrete as they are today, right?
Yeah.
So
I'm just curious how that would have been for calculating royalties if they were even doing that. Oh,
yeah,
that would
it
have been
wasn't
such a mess. Okay.
Yeah, wasn't a thing.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm glad about that since it, I don't know, was part of the evolution of film music, I guess.
Right. Would have been tricky.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we have the silent films, we have the cue books, and then we have pastiche scores, and we have actual film scores for the silent
Original
films like
scores.
Metropolis. Yeah, original scores like Metropolis, composed by
Gottfried Hupertz, who worked with Lang on a few other films as well. He did the Ring of the Nibelung, a film based on the same material as the Wagner opera, right? Yeah.
Did it use any of the Wagner?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that worked. I've never seen it, never really listened to it. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There is something that you mentioned throughout your book, which is not only so there's the religious context of the Dies Irae, and then it gets stripped of that and becomes secular, and it becomes more of a symbol for horror or a marker of horror or death. But then there are sort of subtleties around that. There's the impending sort of doom, and then there's the bad stuff is happening now. The death is happening now. There's kind of a few ways that the original symbol has been distilled. And I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so this was the sort of the main thrust of the next chapter, which is my typology chapter. This is where I said, okay, I've got these 300 films, but not all of them use that original 8-note phrase. And so what I realized was that you could subdivide this master list into a couple of different types. And so it was really 3 main types that I was seeing again and again and again. And so the first type is the one that we've been talking about. It's those first 8 notes at least, sometimes more, like in the Berlioz, right? And I gave it the nickname of the Prelude to Evil, because almost always this type occurs at the beginning or early on in a film. And it was almost like a preview. It was saying, okay, something spooky is going to happen later in the film. So you look at The Shining, right? Nothing inherently scary is happening on the screen. It's a car driving up a mountain. But we know once he gets to that hotel that bad things are going to happen. And so this type 1 happens again and again, hardly ever with, synchronized with something scary.
Shall we watch the opening to The Shining?
Sure.
A little bit?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so this is the first thing we hear in the movie.
We know nothing about the characters.
Right.
I love that little plucky thing.
Yeah. So Wendy Carlos worked very closely with her producer, Rachel Elkind. And so eventually, as you get 3-4 minutes into that clip, you hear these sort of eerie, spooky vocalizations. And that's actually Rachel Elkind's voice performing that as well. So again, nothing spooky happening, but as an audience, we know that melody is a sort of, it's a preview to something that's coming, right? So there's a built-in narrative associated with this melody. And so that happened again and again, and that's by far the biggest sort of example and the biggest collection of examples. That type 1 is the biggest group in the book.
Is it
so that's
mostly in opening credits?
It's
or opening
It's
scenes?
hard to say mostly, yeah, but it's always before something scary. There is a subgroup that is exactly opening titles. That's about 15 to 20. So about 60% of the type 1 are specifically preludes or opening titles. So
that is really interesting. That's a lot.
There's a lot of these sort of branching, subgroups within.
Would the Screaming Skull be another example of that?
Yes.
Okay.
And
you can play a little bit of that.
There's a loud scream in that one as well.
Okay.
But yeah,
Beware,
that's,
listeners.
again, opening sequence.
skull also looks like bad news.
Yeah.
Interesting rhythm.
Yeah. So I like the Screaming Skull. It's a cheesy B horror movie, but it's got that sort of manipulation to the rhythm that is sort of interesting. It still reads as a Dies Irae, right? You still recognize it as a Dies Irae, but it's got these sort of slight little rhythmic changes. There's a little syncopation later on. And then you've got the chaotic screaming as well, for the Screaming Skull. This film is interesting because after this opening sequence, or is it right before? It's right before. There's an off-screen narrator who is basically trying to scare you into saying, "Don't watch this movie. This movie's too scary for you." And the casket opens, and there's a sign inside the casket that says "reserved for you." So the implication is you're going to die if you watch this movie. You're going to be scared to death. There were a lot of these sort of gimmicks in the 50s for these B horror movies. So
okay, so type 1, usually
so
prelude
that's
to
type
evil.
1.
But
Usually
not always
prelude. Yeah, right. They're always happening ahead of time, and they're usually in the opening titles.
And it's
now,
explicit quotation of the first 8 notes.
Right. And so that's right. And it can be more, but it has to be at least those 8. For whatever reason, the first 4 notes is a sort of a later evolution. So what I then discovered is that this next sort of chunk, this next group, this type 2, would use just those 4 notes as what I call an ominous echo. And these type 2s almost always happen just after something scary, whether it's a death or a jump scare of some sort. And then in the score, you'll hear just the first 4 notes. Da, 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 da. And so the iconic example of this is Home Alone. Every time Kevin McAllister sees his creepy neighbor, the boy, whether it's the group of the cousins or just Kevin, he then hears that 4-note Dies Irae, the type 2. Do you want to play that?
I don't think I have an example for that one.
Did I not give you that one? Oh, that's a shame. Well, you can picture that in your head, right? Every time they see the uncle, you hear da 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 da. And that's
I'm sure there's a clip on YouTube that I can link to.
Yes, absolutely. So that's John Williams. And John Williams, I guess the other iconic example of that is in Star Wars, in the Burning Homestead sequence.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Which you definitely have.
Yeah, definitely have that one. And you've definitely talked about it.
And we've talked about it on this pod, right?
Yes. But let's review for all the listeners. So good. And
I'm pretty certain that that's probably my first Dies Irae that I heard in film. Star Wars, my mom used to say that Star Wars was my first babysitter, that she would plunk me in front of A New Hope when I was a kid. So it's been in there forever. So Luke finds the burnt ashes of the skeletons of his aunt and uncle. We hear the Force theme and then those 4 notes only of the Dies Irae. So again, an ominous echo, right? Something just after a scary moment, or marks a scary moment in a score.
Right, and so since it's only the first 4 notes, it is arguably more subtle. Yeah, and more up to,
right.
I don't want to say interpretation, but then you go into like, how do you personally decide whether something gets to be considered a Dies Irae in your catalog, at least. Yeah, because there has to be more than just the notes. There has to be some.
There has to be a
context.
narrative purpose for it as well, right? So those 4 notes, and they have to be reacting to something seen on screen. And ideally they are sort of linked, right? That we see something scary and then we hear those 4 notes. Now, it's interesting that instead of 4 notes, you never hear an 8-note phrase as a ominous echo, right? That the composers that are using this, whether they do it on purpose or not, that's another question. But I don't have an example of a Dies Irae type 1 functioning like a type 2. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense.
Yeah. And so there must be a musicological purpose for that, right? That they must be saying, okay, those 4 notes are enough of a signal to reference the Dies Irae, but I want to get out of the scene, get out of this cue without playing all 8 notes.
Yeah. I wonder, I'm thinking like from a composer standpoint, if there's something to do with the time you have to make your point and
right.
Just wanting to get out of there.
It's much more like an exclamation point, right? Just having those 4 notes as a sort of a button on a cue or a scene. And that is one thing I try to elucidate in the book, is that the Dies Irae, whether it's in this type 1 formulation or the type 2, that they are set apart from the remainder of the score. They're not really embedded wholesale. They do stand apart. So in that Star Wars clip, we've got them in the French horns sort of blaring
like a
as a sort of
melody.
addition. Yeah, as a counter melody, right? You hear it in The Shining, right? That the tuba and bassoon down there in the bass register, so set apart from everything else. And so I really think that composers are trying to highlight the non-normality, the unusual nature of this melody in their scores.
Now, what would you say to, I think, Jin's theme or something in Rogue One, where it's like part of it?
Yeah. That's a good question. And I definitely hear that as a Dies Irae reference, right? That Jin's theme is there. It's sort of modeled and shaped on the Dies Irae. But given its non-explicit nature, that it really is sort of a secondary reference in my head, right? Mm-hmm. That especially in that score, since we have much more explicit Dies Iraes throughout, I think we can point to Jin's theme and say that's related, but definitely a sort of secondary, maybe even a tertiary, given the layers of Dies Irae there. But I'm sure that Giacchino is sort of steeped in Star Wars musical language, that is very much part of his process. Yeah.
Yeah. So would you not consider it even a type 2?
Yeah, I probably, Jin's theme would not really sort of make even a type 2, because it doesn't sort of function as a reaction to something. Right. So I would probably consider it either a 1 or 3 variation. So I do have these sort of B monikers, so a 1B or a 2B or a 3B, as something that is similar to the melody but has some alterations to it. So I give a little caveat in my list just to sort of fit in a few extra things that I think really believe are Dies Iraes, but have some music issues, shall we say.
Have some tweaks.
Yeah.
Okay. So like a type 1A would be like a pure, the 8 notes. Right. Type 1B might be a note is altered.
Yeah. That maybe it falls a half step higher or lower on the sort of the way it unfolds. The classic example, it's actually from Metropolis, type 2B. There's a spy. We don't have to get into the story. It's kind of convoluted, but there's a spy. And every time the spy appears on screen, we hear a type 2B. And so it has 3 of the 4 type 2 notes, the last interval falls a major third, not a minor third. And so I didn't feel comfortable calling that a perfect type 2, but a type 2B is how I label that.
Yeah. I'd like to play that. Maybe you can point out where the alteration is.
Okay. Yep. So this is, that's the spy on the right.
Is that the whole clip? Yeah, that is.
Yeah, that's a short
that was
clip.
It.
So it really is just, if we want to get into the weeds, falling a minor half step. So say G to F sharp and then back to G. And then it falls down to an E flat, not an E natural.
Right. So instead of it's
Right. And so it still functions narratively like this. Something spooky has happened. The spy comes on screen and then we hear dun, 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 instead of the proper falling a minor third. So again, it's kind of in the weeds analytically, but it functions still as a type 2 in my ear and on the list. Yeah,
no, it's helpful to have the option of B because I feel like there are a lot of Bs.
And I get a lot of emails with, what about this? What about that? And the ones that function that way, I really want to include in the list, but I really want to be strict about it as well, because we could really be pretty liberal about this, and the project would never end, I think.
Right.
So
is that why some things on your list are crossed out on your spreadsheet?
Yeah, and so that public list that I've given, not in the book, I've included, I believe in, I stand by everyone in the book.
Right.
So
I just mean the one on your website.
Yeah, so the one on my website, I've sort of evolved on how I'm thinking about different cues. And if I crossed it out, I put it in a video, but it probably wasn't quite good enough to make the cut for the book.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Going back, I have a question about the Home Alone example.
Sure.
So John Williams knows how, he has stated that he has used Dies Irae on purpose. He knows what he's doing with it. Given that, what's that Christmas song? Carol of the Bells is also used in that movie, which has the same first 4 notes as Dies Irae. Yeah, what do you see that? It's kind of like a double entendre when those 4 notes are used.
I really sort of love this section of the book. So Home Alone is a really fascinating example because Kevin sees his creepy neighbor, the old neighbor, Old Man Marley. Yeah, Old Man Marley, 3 times. And each time he sees them, we hear that Dies Irae type 2 sort of stinger. And then they meet in the church, right? So this is right before the big climax of the film. Kevin's there at the church and Marley is there as well. And they talk and they actually come to an understanding that the neighbor is not creepy at all, that he's just different than Kevin, right? And so they've sort of have this transformation in their relationship. And as that is happening, we start to hear Carol of the Bells, which again has those first 4 notes, but it represents a new relationship between Kevin and Marley, right? And so we see them again the next time we see Marley, he's, spoiler alert, he's rescuing Kevin at the end of the movie. And we don't hear the Dies Irae. So the Dies Irae was Marley's... Point. Exactly. It pivots from creepy neighbor who we don't know into, now that we've met him and we know he's a nice guy, he's not a bad guy. Now the Dies Irae goes away. So,
the first time it pivots, instead of being Dies Irae, it's Carol of the Bells.
Right. Exactly.
That's so clever.
Carol of the Bells is now saying that we're taking those notes, but now it's something different. And so what's fascinating, the next immediate cue after Carol of the Bells is called Setting the Trap. And it's Kevin going home and setting all the all the traps in his house. And the opening notes are bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-da-dum bum 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 ba-da-dum. And so again, bum ba-da-dum is again those first four notes, but they're divorced from that Dies Irae narrative, right? The Carol of the Bells has sort of washed away the creepy narrative and transformed it into this sort of the positive, let's go protect this house melody.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's been a long time since I've seen Home Alone. Like since
I watch it every holidays. Every year.
Really? I actually think
yeah.
I've only seen it like in elementary school on rainy days.
Oh wow, okay. It's a great, December Christmas movie. It's got fantastic music by John Williams, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So,
on the note of type twos, where the context might not be there to make it a Dies Irae, I'm really happy that you sent me this example, because I was recently watching a movie and we were like, does this Columbia Pictures logo count?
And so the stinger for that cue is the Dies Irae, those last four notes. Now, I've been including that Columbia logo music as the sort of the prelude to my videos. When I make a Dies Irae supercut, I use that as my like introductory music and as sort of an inside joke, right? Because it's clearly not a Dies Irae,
Right.
because it doesn't have the narrative to back it up, right? So to be a proper Dies Irae, one that I'm including here, it's got to have the musical component, but it's also have to have the narrative purpose for it. So yeah, not going to count for that logo music.
I wanted to point that one out specifically because there have been questions, and I did ask my Discord server if people had questions about Dies Irae, and I think probably the question that recurs the most is like, does it just have to be the four notes, or does there have to be something else? And yes, there has to be something else. Is your stance?
And that's sort of, I hope that this book, it's practically 80,000 words on the Dies Irae, and I hope that that's one of the big takeaways is that yes, it has to be the music has to be right, but it has to be supported by the drama, right? Music is supporting the image here, and so that's a big takeaway for the book.
Yeah. Whatever. I just realized in the Columbia Pictures logo, what stands out to me is its Lydianness, and the Lydian scale naturally lends itself to having a Dies Irae.
Right,
You have that
raised fourth.
Sharp four. Yeah, and so I feel like if we were just looking at four notes, then we would see too many of those. Like in E.T., I'm sure there's some that are actually more of a Lydian thing.
Right.
But
and Lydian is such a uplifting and happy mode versus the Dies Irae, which is not. So that's a sort of interesting thing to chew on as well. Where does this combination of intervals, where does it fit within the mode, within the scale? How does that have a part to play as well?
Yeah, although you do have some fun examples that are like especially the Morricone examples that are like,
oh yeah,
oh, that sounds actually really fun.
I love the Morricone examples. They are they're just fantastic clips. I really enjoy those. So
yeah, they're very good.
Yeah.
Shall we move on to talking about type 3?
Yeah, let's talk about type 3 because this is the one that I imagine most people will be confused about. This is the one that is most divorced from the original sort of context. So in my formulation, the type 3 is built on type 2. It takes those first 4 notes, da 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 da, but it subjects those 4 notes to 2 different kinds of variation. I label them either the ostinato kind, which is essentially just repeating those 4-note a 4-note pattern, da 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 da, again and again and again. Or what I call the fortspinnung type, which is a sort of nerdy musicological term, which basically just means something that unfolds. So it takes those 4 notes and uses it in a sort of transformational way. Do you want to play a couple just so we get this in our ear?
Yes. What's a good one, too?
The Mars Attacks is a good ostinato example. So it takes those 4 notes, da 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 da, and sort of repeats them again and again.
Great. Okay.
So that should be 420.
Yes.
So
that's
Danny
a really good one.
Elfman's score, yeah, you hear that da 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 dun dun da da dun dun dun, which is the Dies Irae, which is this type 3 ostinato, repeated again and again.
Is that not the spinning technique? That one,
So
because it kind of goes into something else. It's like dun, 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 dun.
It's got other things involved, but a better fortspinnung type is the Jurassic Park cue. Do you want to play that one?
Yeah, we will definitely do that.
Because this is a really good example of fortspinnung, taking those 4 notes and then spinning it forward into something different.
Where's the other car? Where's the other car? Alan!
Dr. Grant!
Alan!
Grant!
So you
Yeah,
could
that's
think
definitely
of
a
it
clear-
as you could think of it as that the Dies Irae, those 4 notes anchoring the cue, and then it spins forward, da 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 da, and then comes back to that anchor, and back and forth again. Again, another John Williams cue. So does that sort of make sense? These 2 different types of the type 3.
Yes. I feel like I hear so many of the fortspinnung types.
Yeah. And these are the ones that you could really you could hear in a lot of action scoring. Both of the type 3s are really action cues. Stuff is happening on screen, whether it's a car chase or it's people running after a bad guy or vice versa. They are energy generating cues. And so I refer to it as the tension engine, which I think is a formulation that you came up with on this
solo
podcast.
Star Wars story. Yeah, I was like, that's the name of an episode that we have.
Yeah, it's a great formulation because it really does work. It's taking those intervals, da 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 da, and using it as a driver, as something to sort of propel us through the sequence. Whereas the type 1 was preparatory, was a preview, was very sort of staid in a way. And then type 2 is an echo, it's a response. And then here we've got this sort of driver beneath an action sequence. So almost all of these cues are very much action driven.
Yeah. I'm wondering, okay, I have a couple questions. One is, are there cases that you've discovered where it is sort of both ostinato and fortspinnung? Because I feel like there's probably a blur.
There's
there.
a lot of a gray area between the 2. And so there are a handful. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head where I really had to say, oh, this could be an ostinato or this could be a fortspinnung, but it's clearly a type 3 either way. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a gray area here, the interpretation for it.
Yeah, because then also the fortspinnung could be like 8 or 10 notes of something, and it could be repeated on an ostinato.
Exactly. So there is a sort of an overlap. The Venn diagram is probably thicker than you'd want it to be. But I think it still helps to divorce these two, just so we could have two separate buckets for this type.
I think that's actually really helpful, because also there's if the notes are out of order, which is you count in many cases, you have ones where it's like,
right.
like, I don't know, 3-1-2-1 instead of 3-2-3-1 and things like that.
The predator cue for Billy's transformation, I think it's figure 4.22. Yeah, 422. This is a great example of that. We've got this ostinato throbbing in the bass, but it's different formulation. So it's not 3-2-3-1. It's 3-1-2-1.
Okay.
So
Billy, let's go.
So this whole cue has that ostinato down below. Da, 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 da.
I think what's interesting is that it's a slow ostinato.
Right. It's slow, but again, it's low. It's in the bass voice, so it recalls that the Berlioz and the Shining in its own way, even though it is respelled, it's reordered. It still has that effect, and narratively, it makes sense, right? We've lost most of the party in Predator. Billy is he's sacrificing himself to help his boss get back to the helicopter, with that other woman, the person they've captured. So narratively, again, it makes sense. It's an action sequence. It's not a full-on action sequence, but it implies action is happening, right? That he's about to fight the Predator on that tree branch. I love the Predator. I would talk about the Predator all day long if I could.
Who did the score? Alan Silvestri.
So it's
right?
Alan Silvestri, right? Who doesn't really appear on my list that much. I think he's the only example is Predator.
Interesting.
Actually, that's not true.
Sounds like a challenge.
Back to the Future has a little sort of offhanded Dies Irae in it as well.
Do you remember what type?
It's the type, I think it's type 1, but it's a very short, it's when he's riding the skateboard. Right before the bad guys have the manure dumped on them in the town square. There's this, I think it's a type 1. I'd have to go back and listen. But yeah, I think that's about it for Alan Silvestri. Yeah.
It's interesting
So
how
that's
there are
type
some.
3. Yeah.
Yes. There are some composers that clearly do it a lot, and so they're represented a lot, like John Williams, Danny Elfman. Yeah.
Morricone.
Morricone. Morricone's examples are so strange and wonderful.
Yeah. Do you want to transition to Morricone since we're kind of there?
Yeah.
So the last chapter, the last real chapter, it looks at 3 different places. It looks at Italy in the counterculture in the 1960s, films that were made and centered there. It also looks at the Friday the 13th franchise, and then it looks at Star Wars. So it's sort of, I didn't know how to really organize these 3, but I knew I wanted to talk about them. So we just had to. And Morricone was the gift that just kept on giving. These cues are fantastic. I mean, I think as film music people, we're all familiar with Morricone, but this is not how I think of Morricone. These early examples, right? We think of him as the spaghetti western, the sort of classic Fistful of Dollars and the Once Upon a Time trilogy, those sort of iconic westerns. But before he started working on Hollywood films, he was working in Italy and working in very unusual films. These are not quite horror films. They're not quite thrillers. Some of them are called giallo films, which is
How do you
it's
spell
hard
that?
to describe. Giallo, giallo. I think it has a reference to the color yellow in Italian, because these books were published and they had yellow covers and they were sort of titillating. They had a lot of sex. They had a lot of violence, not quite horror, but in that vein. And so they have this whole genre called giallo. And he got his start working on a few of these giallo films. And so there is the threat of death. There is murder involved, but nearly all of them have rock music fused with the Dies Irae. Almost every example that I talked about has that sort of rock backbeat, jazz inflection to it. So I'm not sure if you want to play one of those.
Yeah, let me.
I think Escalation is probably the best example. Did I give you Escalation?
Yeah, that's a fun one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's do that one. Are those all? Yeah. What lyrics are they using?
So they're saying Dies Irae, just in a sort of an unusual accent. It's a sort of sung Italian, but it's got this rock backbeat to it. The story is about this flower power child. It's set in the 1960s, and that cue is called Dies Irae psychedelico. And so it's supposed to have that sort of tie-dye, you see it in the titles, right? Flavor to it. Just a fantastic clip. I really fell in love with that one. That was probably the earliest Morricone Dies Irae that I heard. And at that point I was like, okay, this is something else. So
yeah, that's really cool. I also think, let's see, what other examples? I mean, I want to do the lyrics only one for sure.
Okay. Well, that's the other thing, is that almost every one of these is sung. And we very rarely, once it's jumped into film music, the Dies Irae isn't really sung. I mean, there are a few diegetic examples where people are singing it in the story, whether it's flagellants that are marching through a town or a priest is chanting it. But those are rare. Typically, they are untexted and just played in the orchestra. But here, Morricone has that sort of that religious grounding. He was Italian. He was raised Catholic. And so you could see that he probably wanted that vocal sort of root to the performance. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. We could do one that is the one that we can do. Let's see. Is Madalena a good one? Or maybe
they're all good. Yeah. Madalena's good. Fist in the Pocket is kind of weird.
Yeah, let's do Fist in the Pocket.
They're all good. Okay.
Yeah. So it almost reminds me of the Carlos.
Yeah, with the arrhythmic,
with the weird
plunking, and yeah, and so I think they describe. How did he describe that? He labeled them as metallic plunks. He had another vivid, can't find it. He described those sort of metallic plunkings, really sort of fascinating sounds. And they sound very Carlos inspired, right? Even though this is before Carlos. This is 30 years before The Shining.
Yeah. So. Lullaby immersed in a dissonant sounds of a metallic vibrating surface. Is that the one? Yeah. And then there's this really weird example that I want to highlight. Let's see. It is Trio Infernale. Yeah, so it's just lyrics.
Right. And this cue, it needs a little explanation. The film is called The Infernal Trio, and it's essentially a dark comedy about an insurance scam. This collection of folks are trying to hide dead bodies and get their money for these people that they've now killed. And so they go through a series of destroying the bodies. And in this clip, they are burning them in acid. They're dissolving them in the bathtub. So you've got the slop of this grisly murder. And the melody is not a Dies Irae, but the lyrics are. So what do you do with this example, right? It's certainly ominous. The narrative is right, but the melody is not there. So I still count this one, just given Morricone's history here in this decade plus. It's clear that the vocal Dies Irae is very much a part of his compositional tool belt. So I'm pretty confident including this one, even though it doesn't quite work. I do call it a 1B though, because the melody is not quite there, right?
Right.
But it's still lyrically there. So
yeah.
So that's Morricone. I really, this whole decade, they're all fantastic, really bizarre films and really bizarre scores, but really great. So that cue was called the Requiem of Sulfuric Acid, the Sinfonetta Requiem al Acido Sulfurico, which is just a great turn of phrase. So,
yeah. And then, of course, you talk about Star Wars, you talk about The Burning Homestead and The Force Awakens and Attack of the Clones and Rogue One.
Right.
Perhaps we should play the Rogue One clip that is more obviously Dies Irae.
Sure. Yeah.
So this would be a 3B ostinato. This is interesting.
Yeah.
It's teasing us.
Melcy, come in, please.
I love this cue because it's layers and layers and layers of Dies Irae, and we're not even there yet. We've still got more that's building and building. Do you want to keep playing?
Yeah, I can keep
Let's
playing.
finish the
The master switch. It's out there, that console.
I'm going!
There we go. So what
So-
do you consider when it actually finally does it? Would that be type 2?
Yeah, so there's a lot here, right? Because
Yes.
we've got this sort of this ostinato down below, and the ostinato is again a B, right? Da 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 da
And it's
da,
inverted.
again and again,
1, 2,
right?
1,
That's
3,
the
1, 2, 1,
inverted
3.
kind, and then on top of that, the da 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 da, which finally turns into Krennic's entrance of the Dies Irae. So I call that a type 2. So it's really a combination of the type 3 and the type 2. And what's fascinating about this is that this cue here at the end of the movie is a culmination of lots of little Dies Iraes that we heard, as you mentioned, in Jin's theme. There's also a type 2 after they leave. What's the planet in the rain where her father is killed on the on the deck? They leave that planet. I'm blanking on it. I need to do another Rogue One rewatch. And as they're all on the spaceship leaving, there's another Type 2 Dies Irae.
Iaru.
So it really is a sort of building layer upon layer upon layer of Dies Irae that culminates here. And then, obviously we all know that everyone dies at the end of this movie. So it is sort of the ultimate narrative connection, a score that's built on the foundation of the Dies Irae that is perfect for this film, for this story.
I think because everyone dies is why maybe I think there could be a case to be made for Jin's theme being a type 1B. Because just it's not. It is kind of foreshadowing a bad thing that is going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is Jin's role in this, is that she's going to sacrifice her life, but in order for, the rebellion to live on and to be successful. So did Giacchino actually build that in? I'd love to corner him and really pick his brain about this. I guess that's sort of the overarching question is, do these composers, are they doing it on purpose or not? Right.
Right.
And so I sort of dig into that a little bit in the final chapter, in the afterword. And the takeaway is that some do and some don't. There's not one sort of definitive answer. There are a lot of composers on the record saying, yes, we did this on purpose. The Harry Manfredini, who did all the Friday the 13th scores, was very upfront. I was able to speak with him, and that was fantastic. And he said he went to Catholic school as a kid, and he did it very much on purpose. And Friday the 13th is a fascinating test case because it doesn't occur in the first 4 films. And then once they bring Jason back from life, they literally animate his body out of a grave, like in the Dies Irae poem, skeletons walking the earth. Then he said, okay, I'm going to include it once. And then the next film, he includes it 15 times. He just went crazy. Every kill practically has a Dies Irae, a type 2 or a type 3 attached to it. So I loved talking to him about that. On the other hand, Bear McCreary, who is on my list 4 or 5 times in very clear examples, told me through a third party that he didn't do it on purpose. There was no Dies Iraes in any of his scores. So, it's really sort of fascinating, what these composers know, what they're drawing on. Is it subconscious? Are they not even knowing that they're doing it, like Bear McCreary?
That is interesting.
Or are they upfront about it? Like John Williams, is very clear talking about it, or Manfredini is another example. So that's what's really fascinating about this melody, is that there's so many examples out there. It's hard to sort of draw clear, definite results from that, whether they did or didn't.
A cynical part of me is maybe thinking, at least when it comes to film and like modern film and TV composers, is maybe someone on their team did know what they were doing, but they didn't necessarily hear every single part of the score that maybe they're additional writers did or something.
That's my guess with Hans Zimmer. Hans Zimmer appears on my list a lot. And as you know, Hans Zimmer has this team working with him or for him. And, you know, it makes you think, okay, does remote control have like a poster of the Dies Irae up there somewhere? They're like, scary scene. Let's include the Dies Irae. You know, Hans is going to be in favor of that. It makes me want to interview someone from remote control that I was never able to get in the door there, because they're on there 4 or 5 times at least. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Though, like, I have friends who are in the film scoring industry, and many, many more composers than people know have teams doing a lot of their work.
Yeah.
So
well, and that's you know, it is a trope, and so if you could sort of, like 100 years ago in the silent film era, if you can copy and paste this melody and it's effective, why not? Right?
Yeah. When you talked to Harry Manfredini, did he say specifically that he acknowledge, did he know that he left it out of the first films from the franchise? Okay.
Yeah. And I was really trying to get him to admit to why he didn't use it. And he really didn't want to go there, but he was very clear about, you know, he said I was struck by the graveyard sort of setting. The movie begins with Jason being reanimated. There's like a lightning strike and there's a person there. It's ridiculous, but you know, so he was really sort of struck by that. And so I think a light bulb went off and he said, okay, let's use it here.
I think what's interesting is, and I only learned this from your book, is that even though the Dies Irae seems to go really well with horror movies. Texas Chainsaw, Halloween, the original movies also don't use it. Right.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder why, right? Because those are sort of classic slashers that all those early 70s and early 80s slashers really don't use it. Once you get into the next generation of the B movies of those slashers in the 80s, they do sort of fall back on the Dies Irae. And so you wonder if there is a lower class status, right, for this trope, right? They're falling back on a trope, you know, that everyone else has used. Is common, so why not use it? Why not incorporate it?
You do call it a musical meme, which it totally is. And so I wonder if it just kind of falls out of circulation for a few years and then kind of is revitalized. Like, I think right now it is alive and well, this musical meme.
Yeah.
But yeah, I could see it maybe lapsing for a little bit.
This idea of a meme is really pertinent because we're all familiar with internet memes, but do we know who the first person was to create that meme, right? We're usually coming to it after the fact, and we've seen other people use it. And so we're much down the line of evolution. Same thing with the Dies Irae, right? All these composers are hearing it based on The Shining. Are they hearing it based on Star Wars? Are they hearing it based on Metropolis from 1927? Who knows? Yeah. But I would think that it's more recent popularity is due to more of these recent films, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Right.
And of course, by podcasters and people talking about it. So now there's like the meta context of, now we have this tool that we all know of.
Right. And internet boards that are, you know, theorizing, or do you hear it here? And my website and my emails, please keep sending the emails, you know? Okay.
So you still are accepting submissions.
I'm still accepting them. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's another book here, but the website will be updated and the list will be updated as we go. Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. So I kind of I have a few like overall questions and questions from, first of all, just to recap, type 1 is the 8 notes, and it tends to happen before anything sinister has occurred. Type 2 is just the 4 notes, which you call motto or incipit as well. And rather than preparing for horrors to come, it reinforces the present horrors.
Yeah. They're like a reaction to a present horror. Yeah.
Yeah. And then type 3 functions like the type 1, by implying that death may be in the near future, I'm quoting from your book, but uses the type 2 musical incipit as its main musical material. So
Right.
it uses the 4 notes in some order, but it kind of functions like the type 1.
Yeah, it's
as the
kind of like a
tension engine.
combination of
Yeah.
the two, right? But the end result of that type 3, the end result of that action sequence is that the implication of death is there. It's present, right? That if something doesn't go wrong, you could survive, but likely death is close. Yeah.
Yes. Are certain types more prevalent in certain eras or genres? Like is type 1 more prevalent in horror? Is type 3 more 80s to present or something like that?
Yeah. So the types have a sort of evolution to them. The first type is very common in the early 50 years or so. And that's why my history sort of stops in the 70s. The type 2 sort of peaks right around Star Wars. It's sort of the inspiration for it there. I guess it doesn't peak there. It sort of starts there. It peaks right around Home Alone in the 90s, which it came out in 1990, then becomes less popular. And then the type 3s really I started noticing them more in the 2000s. So I actually have a graph in here that sort of spells this out and shows type 1 is really popular and then falls out of prominence. It's probably seen as a little old fashioned to include the whole chant in the melody, right? And then type 2s peak around, they start with Star Wars in 77 and then peak at Home Alone in 1990. So that decade. In terms of genre, it's hard to say. I really don't want to point to a specific genre or not. I mean, horror is the most common genre here. There are a handful of comedies that has the Dies Irae in it.
True.
But they are, I'm sorry?
I said true.
Oh, yeah. And they're there to sort of underscore comedy. They're there to underscore humor. I've been sort of chewing on a new idea about that, but we'll see if anything comes from that as we go. So
cool. And I guess type 3 maybe doesn't have to do with genre necessarily, but action sequences often.
Right. Which often, it depends on the film, but it's really an action sequence depending on what kind of film you're in.
Yeah, true. So does the type 2 and beyond Dies Irae, do you see that as a sort of a watering down of the original Dies Irae?
This is interesting. Again, we're talking about this idea of the meme and the evolution of the meme. So yes, we are divorcing it from that original context. But once we're in film music, we're already divorcing it. We're watering it down already, right? So as we talked about earlier, that evolution, that transformation from sacred to secular, we lose that sort of liturgical footing. And so when we go from type 1 to type 2, yes, you're even further removed from that. Type 2s never have vocals, right? So we listen to those Morricone examples that had the vocalists, and that sort of brings us back to that old-fashioned sort of liturgical feel. So yes, I think that they are they're excerpting it further and further away from that root melody. But that's what makes this meme, this musical meme, live on, right? It's able to sort of sprout new roots as we transform from type 1 to type 2 to type 3. Yeah.
Have you noticed any trends or clusters around the way that the Dies Irae is harmonized?
I haven't really noticed too much. It doesn't get harmonized that much. It really, and I sort of talk about this a little bit in the introduction, that it is such an other, right? This based in medieval music, that it is this modal sort of structure to it. It's hard for modern ears to then sort of harmonize it. But this sort of medieval modality is sort of accepted by our modern ears. We recognize it as something different, something other. And so I think that's why, and I talk about this in the introduction, this is partly why it works so well in horror, because horror is about a monstrous other, right? Whether it's Jason or whoever, Michael Myers, whoever it may be, those others are a threat to the normalness of everyday life. And that's what makes horror movies fun, right? It's something we don't normally see in theory. And so the Dies Irae is that other, right? It's based on something that's texted. It's based on something that it's modal. Hearing that in modern 2025 in a modern film really makes it stand out, makes it stand apart. So it is this sort of horrific other its own way.
Yeah, and I think in horror, especially when it's on a pad of aleatoric sounding,
right,
weird sounds, it really does stand out as, as almost an entity in itself.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at The Shining, the rest of that score is all modern, pre-existent music by Bartók and Ligeti and Penderecki, and it sounds unusual, right? It is not Mozart, it's not Beethoven. And so that's a real chicken and egg moment. Does horror music sound like The Shining because of The Shining, or vice versa, right? Do we associate that with scary sounds in and of itself?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
And so the Dies Irae is in Strange Bedfellows with Bartók and Penderecki, right? It is part of that score. And so we associate it with that, whether we think about it or not.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything notable that you want to share about vampire movies? We kind of skipped over the whole vampire section, but
I love these vampire movies. So the Hammer horror films, these are like B-movie films from a British company called Hammer Horror. And really the vampire and the Dies Irae are perfect partners, right? Because the vampire is in itself an exotic sort of other, right? It is this creature that was a human but no longer is. And there's always sort of religion involved in these vampire movies, right? There's usually a priest with a cross trying to stab him in the chest. And so the presence of the Dies Irae is kind of like this vampire. It is a sacred object that has been bastardized and turned into something secular, just like the Dies Irae, right? Mm-hmm. And so it has the veil of religion to it, like a vampire in a way, right? But it stands apart from that religious world. So the Dies Irae finds its way into 10 or 12 vampire movies here in the 60s and into the 70s. And I think it's a perfect mix. It's a perfect sort of combination.
Are those the ones with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee?
Right.
Yeah.
So if
Star Wars connection there.
It's a lot of Star Wars there too, right? It's great to see Peter Cushing, acting his heart out. Christopher Lee, this monstrous, he's like 7 feet tall practically. Yeah. Yeah. And it's great to see Count Dooku, in a different world. So.
Yeah. Okay. So if a Dies Irae is confirmed to be accidental, like I think Alien was another example.
Yeah.
But it still fits really well. Do you still count it?
I have to count Alien. That one, absolutely. And that's a fascinating story. We don't really need to dig into it now, but I really sort of go into all the details in the chapter. Essentially, this is another one of those examples where the editor and the director messed up what the composer wanted. And so Jerry Goldsmith had a whole score. They ripped it apart. They used some of his other music from other films. And then they added on a clip from Howard Hanson's Symphony No. 2. And it ends with a perfect 4-note type 2. And it's it's the last notes you hear in the movie. Right, Ripley has just ejected the xenomorph from her ship, and she gets down into the pod to go to sleep, and you hear this beautiful romantic symphony play, and the final 4 notes are the type 2 Dies Irae. So it's too perfect not to include it.
Yeah, so I guess the answer is yes on a case-by-case basis. Because, I mean, yeah.
As the Dies Irae guru, I'm taking my privilege and using it how I want to in this place. Yeah.
I mean, do you include Bear McCreary scores, even though he has confirmed?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So
Yeah.
I think it has to still count because the composer, you may have forgotten even that you meant to do it. You
Right.
could have just been inspired, but you don't remember where the inspiration came from. Anyway, yeah,
Right.
I think
How
that's
could
valid.
we possibly know what these composers wanted, or we're only working with what we've got. So
Yeah. I appreciate in the book how you transcribe the alien part where it's the Goldsmith score and then where it switches to the Hansen symphony.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So final big question is so I know that this book is for anyone who's interested in Dies Irae.
Mm-hmm.
It is also a textbook. So how would you recommend if people are teaching or whatever, and maybe how do you plan to use it in the classroom?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you have a whole
It's a really
class
good
dedicated
question.
to Dies Irae, or could it be part of a larger film music class or something?
Yeah, it's funny how it keeps coming up in all my classes. I'm offhandedly, as you can see in chapter blah blah blah, whichever chapter it may be. I think the book, I don't know if the book as a whole could be. I mean, it could be a textbook for a class. If you were doing a Hollywood film scoring sort of survey, it covers a lot of ground. It talks about everything from the silent film to sort of current day scores. But it also sort of digs in to really specific scores and cues. So I think it would give you a really interesting background into the evolution of the sort of Hollywood film scoring tradition. I think that first Carlos Berlioz chapter, the second chapter, could be a really good standalone that would appeal to a lot of different classes, whether it's a survey class or a film scoring class. It would really give you a lot of background for this melody, for this theme. But yeah, I think it could, my hope is that it's an interesting read for music folks and film folks and that sort of intersection. Because the Dies Irae is sort of like the mother sauce for so much in film scoring. There's so much there and it really fascinated me. This is the book I want to read, and that's why I wrote it.
Yeah, it's podcasters who do film music analysis too. I would definitely read this. Yeah, is there also if you buy the book, is there a place where you can hear all the examples?
So yeah, I'm working on that.
Cool.
I think that would be helpful. I don't have the rights to any of this though. So,
right. Okay, but all the examples you have transcribed, is that?
Yeah, they're all transcribed in the book, and then I've got all my videos linked on my website, so those will always be there. So yeah, and I gave you timestamps in the book for every single transcription. So my hope was that, even if you can't find the score, you can find it in the film, because I based all of these transcriptions on the film, not necessarily the soundtrack itself.
Yeah, that makes
so
sense.
you should be able to find it in the film and verify and listen for yourself. Yeah.
Well, do you have any final things that you'd like to say? Thanks for coming on and talking about
thanks
Dies
for
Irae.
having. This has been great, and I just wanted to thank you, Xanthi, because you've been a big driver for my thought process on this. When did we do A New Hope? That was 5 years ago?
Yeah, that was like 2021 or something.
Right. So you were asking some really fascinating questions back in that podcast. So that got me thinking and got me sort of chewing on bigger sources. And so I've been writing it proper for the last 2 years or so. But this project has been sort of bubbling in the background ever since that first podcast. So thank you for
I'm so happy to hear that.
helping sort of be the catalyst for a lot of this. Yeah.
That's I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and then thanks for coming on. It just for so many
Absolutely.
seasons, and having minutes to look at and talk about.
Happy to chat. I just What's next? What's the next film on the docket?
Return of the Jedi.
Ah, fascinating. Okay.
Are you in?
I'm in. Absolutely.
Great.
Love me an Ewok.
Good. That's the right answer. So where can people find you and your work online? I know you have a YouTube channel, and where can they find the book? Submit
Yeah.
Dies Iraes?
So my website really has links to everything, alex-ludwig.net. You can find me. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm no longer on Twitter, but I'm skeeting. Is that what we're doing at Blue Sky?
I refuse to call it that.
Yeah, it sounds weird coming out of my mouth. But yeah, so you can find me at Blue Sky or my website, and the book is published with Palgrave. So you can find a link to all that at my website.
Great. That's perfect. Yeah, and listeners, you can find Star Wars Music Minute at most of the places. Still on Twitter, but also on Blue Sky.
There you go.
And this is a mid-season break, but I will be doing Return of the Jedi season next, and also will be doing Andor coverage on the YouTube channel. So that won't be in the podcast feed. But yeah, tune in if you're interested in Andor coverage. I think that's all we have for today. No themes to run through, no soundtrack titles, not the usual end of episode spiel. But once again, thank you so much, Alex. This has been a very valuable episode for listeners who are interested in Dies Irae. And I'm just so relieved to have more historical knowledge and reference now for when I talk about Dies Irae.
That's great. I'm happy to sort of chat with anyone who's got questions. Please reach out to me. You can find my email on my website and online at all the places. So happy to talk Dies Irae anytime.
Perfect. All right. See you next time, whenever that is, listeners. May the Force be with you.